what I am doing is hyper-masculine, which is no rules.
Jordan Peterson sat down with Charlie Kirk to discuss God, using God's name in vain, and hyper-masculinity.
There's a commandment not to use God's name in vain. And then there's the comments in the Gospels about the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are exactly the people who use religious terminology, so moral terminology, to cloak their power-seeking machinations, right? And Christ goes after them. I think the best account of that is in Matthew, where he tells them that they're like, it's pretty brutal, that they're like
broods of vipers. Yeah.
Worse, they're like graves full of rotting bodies that someone whitewashed, right? And he says that if they would have, they're the people, had they been alive in the time of the prophets they purport to follow, they would have been part of the mob that would have killed them, right? That's actually part of, you may know this, but that's part of what sets them up for the crucifixion, right? Because they're not very happy with those insults publicly delivered. But that shows you also how old the problem is. So you can imagine one of the worst possible sins is to take the highest possible virtue. So that would be, well, we stand for the oppressed, we stand for the poor, and then to gerrymander that so that your standing for that only pushes you towards power.
That's right.
Right. And so, and then it also, there's a clue in the Gospels, I think it's in the Gospels as well, about how you figure that out. And the answer is, by their fruits you will know them, right? So you look at, well, what I've done is I looked at the consequences, for example, of the green energy programs in Germany and the UK. Well, what's the consequence? Let's take Germany. Germany pollutes far more per unit of energy than they did 10 years ago, and their energy prices are 5 times as high. They're completely dependent on dictators of the worst sort.
Yes.
They continue to make the same mistakes. They're deindustrializing very, very cataclysmically. It's destabilizing their political environment, and that falls disproportionately on the poor. I don't see a way around that analysis.
And nature worshiping is not anything new. All throughout the scriptures.
No, that's right.
Elijah, I mean, is that whole story is a manifestation of the nature worshipers versus...
This is an interesting observation by Jordan Peterson. I hadn't thought about it like this before, but it does make sense. The Pharisees were the religious leaders at the time, and part of their responsibility was to lead people back to God. They were supposed to be modeling what it looked like to be in relationship with God, but they were doing the opposite. Not all of them, to be sure, but as a whole, this is the impression that we get. By not leading the people to God and elevating tradition to the point that it became a burden to the people that they were to serve, they were in a sense using God's name in vain. In the New Testament, what we see is a power struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This is why when Paul in the book of Acts is brought before the authorities, he says that he is being accused because he believes in the resurrection of the dead. This was something that the Pharisees believed, that they held to, but something that the Sadducees denied. When Jesus calls them out as whitewashed tombs, it's a big deal. This was Jesus standing up to the religious order at the time for not doing what the scriptures commanded. This is why, as the narrative progresses, the Pharisees and the religious leaders are working together to get rid of him. This was one of the major problems that Jesus had with them, right? With the Pharisees as a whole. Jesus mentions how they'll help an oxen on the Sabbath, but they won't help their fellow brother because it breaks the Sabbath. What they were doing was hypocritical. I am going to push back here a bit on the whole nature worshiping thing. I don't think it's fair to compare what we see happening today to what they were doing in the Old Testament. I can see how you can make some parallels, but it's a stretch to say that it's the same. I don't think it's helpful to conflate the two. The scriptures do call us as Christians to care for the land. The scriptures call us to be good stewards. Now, I can see how this can get turned around to mean something completely different, and I think that's the focus here. But we don't want to turn around and do the same. We want to try to allow the scripture to speak, right? Let the text speak for itself.
The belief in God. But back to just to reiterate a very profound point you made. In evangelical circles, we get wrong, which is people think do not take the Lord's name in vain, just to say do not say God in an expletive way. It actually, the word is don't carry the name's Lord, the name of the Lord in vain, meaning don't do actions in the name of God. So you're exactly right. And so people wear the costume of the holy, or they appropriate.
Well, that's exactly what Christ tells the Pharisees. Literally, he says they wear the garbs of the priestly
and we are,
to elevate their moral status.
This is how Carmen Ames puts this whole idea of using God's name in vain. She's written a couple of books kind of focus on this topic. Here's what she says. The essence of Exodus 20, verse 7, is broader and more profound than merely refraining from saying God's name irreverently or taking hasty oaths. Now, this is from a website, Navigating Faith. I'll try to include the link in the description. But this is how the author unpacks this statement. It is a commission to live lives that accurately and honorably reflect God's character. God has marked his people with his name such that his people represent him to the watching world. Misrepresentation of God, then either through one's words or actions, is the core prohibition the commandment addresses. Another quote here from Carmen Ames. She says, it's impossible for a non-believer to take God's name in vain. They haven't taken his name at all, so they cannot violate the command not to take God's name in vain. If a person doesn't take God's name in the first place, he or she cannot take his name in vain. Carmen Ames, well-respected scholar. You can actually take a course on Exodus from her through the Bible Project for free. Recommend checking it out if this is something that you're interested in. I haven't taken the course yet, but the Bible Project's material tends to be very high quality. So check it out.
Hanani.
Which is here I am. So you remember in the Moses,
right? So he's making himself available.
But remember, Abraham said that with the binding of Isaac when God
it's the same phrase.
Here I am, and the call of Samuel. Here I am, for example. So that phrase "Here I am," Hanani, is repeated about 7 times throughout the Old Testament.
And how do you spell it?
Hanani. I don't know how to spell Hebrew, but it's "Here I am." It's in the English translation.
Right. So it's like, take me, use me. I'm available
I am
for
yours,
this assignment.
mold me. I am your obedient vessel.
Right. That's like the Mission Impossible motif. Your assignment, if you choose to accept
Exactly. But it's a very powerful,
then it burns.
It's a very powerful Hebrew word. It's basically, here I am. My arms are out. I am yours. Full surrender to your purpose. To the bottom of it, it actually brought me back to my Christian upbringing and my roots.
Which is, well, that's what happens to Moses, because when he gets to the bottom of things, it's the voice of the spirit of his ancestors, right? It's
because
the voice
eventually
of God.
I was reading Hayek, Road to Serfdom, and I had kind of an aha moment. I said, there's a lot of good and evil claims in this book.
Right.
By what standard are they saying something is good?
Right, exactly.
So it brought me back to my Christianity, because in the the Road to Serfdom, it's all about the idea of how government tyranny will swallow society, will envelop it, but it happens in steps. And I said, time out. There's truth claims being made embedded in this. By what standard do we consider this?
How did you figure that out? There's a foundational.
There's a substructure.
That's why I started studying psychology.
And so that's where I started to take, and I take my faith very seriously. I love your biblical series, your Exodus series, and your gospel series is terrific. You deserve a lot of credit for that. And it's been phenomenal.
Daily Wire types deserve a lot of credit for that too, because they took a big risk.
Yeah, but you had the initiative to bring everybody together, and you did a great job with it, and you presented it in a way that I'd never have, because you have a very unique psychological understanding and interpretation of the scriptures.
Yeah, well, we had great panelists too. Like, they were a very good crowd, the people that decided
phenomenal.
to participate. It was really good.
What ended up happening is, as I started to pursue the scriptures more and take it seriously, remember back to our timeline, simultaneously the woke stuff all of a sudden reared its head, which is a manifestation of the spiritual.
So
definitely. Almost, I was in this place in 2018, 2019, when it was almost peak woke. We weren't there yet. 2020 was peak woke, where I was starting to understand what was really going on here, that this was a manifestation of a spiritual struggle.
I like what Charlie has to say here. I think he has some really good takes. I appreciate his emphasis on responding to what God is calling you to and what that looks like on a personal level. This idea of surrender is key. People want to do great things for God, and that should be applauded. Great things to advance the kingdom, but they're not always willing to surrender. There's a process to this. And a lot of times, people want to jump ahead and skip the steps that are necessary to helping you become the person God is calling you to be. In order to get there, we must surrender to Him. I think his focus on the standard is on point. These kinds of claims aren't made in a vacuum. You have to have something to ground them on. People don't like to hear this, but if you don't have a standard, then there is no good or bad. There is no truth or false. And if that standard is not outside of yourself, then it's all just a matter of opinion. If this is why standards for morality based on empathy and evolution fall short. There is no solid grounding for them. Charlie did just do a sit down with Frank Turek. Maybe this is why the concept of standard is so fresh on his mind. This famous line by Frank Turek is that true? I do agree, at least to an extent, with his take on wokeness and the spiritual aspect of it. It really depends on how he is defining wokeness. But there is definitely a spiritual aspect to this idea of wokeness, right? Just based on the focus of trying to redefine good and evil and just seeing the harm that these views have caused to people, especially when you think about the transformer stuff and the hormones. This is why these new papers that have come out showing the harm have been so crucial, right? It's showing that, hey, this isn't good. This concept that we've been trying to promote for years is harming people. We need to dial this back.
Amphitheaters, they're out there in trees, they're everywhere. I mean, you could see these images. We can supply them to you if you want to.
Yeah, we do that.
You could superimpose them over this discussion.
Let's do that. Yeah.
And I'm not making this up. I'm not exaggerating. I mean, they're as far as the eye can see, these crowds are there. And part of it, we must be honest, is they want to see a good verbal combat because they don't get it at the university. You see,
right.
They're not. There's something
that's partly likely part of the pathological feminization.
Yes, without
no competition.
But you think about it. What I am doing is hyper-masculine, which is no rules except, hey, we're just going to go basically figure this out. This is the closest thing to a verbal street fight that one can have.
Right.
Anyone can show up to the mic, prove me wrong. I have no notes. I have no AI. I have nothing. Tell me why you're correct. For 3 hours, I will sit there and everyone will watch. It's a gladiatorial match for the best ideas of the West.
I agree with his take here when it comes to the lack of debate at the universities. This has not been helpful. People aren't exposed to different ideas. They don't know how to answer when they're being pressed on their views. And it doesn't allow them to see how their worldview stacks up against others. I do think we should be careful here. There are quite a few women who are very good debaters or enjoy debates. So I want to make sure that we're not being too broad here and kind of falling into this trap of stereotyping. Charlie's idea that he's trying to portray this as hyper-masculine, I don't think is the most helpful. And this whole thing of saying that there's no rules, it just feeds the idea that men are essentially savages. This is something that Nancy Pearcey unpacks in her book, The War on Toxic Masculinity. Would recommend definitely checking that book out. But this idea that men were just savages is something that was espoused by evolutionists back in the day. Now, he says this whole idea that there are no rules, but clearly that's not correct. If you've seen any of his interactions, there are at least some rules, right? You can't just speak over the other person as they're speaking. You got to, somebody speaks and you respond. So there are some guidelines there in place. I understand what he's trying to say from the standpoint of, hey, it's not overly regulated. We're having a conversation. Now, I think that's helpful. Ultimately, I agree with the stance that we should have debates, and the lack of debates is what's causing a lot of these issues that we're seeing now, right? The result of the refusal to engage in conversations. This idea that certain topics are off limits, that's not helpful. The way we grow as people, the way we grow as a society is by engaging with one another on topics that we disagree with. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.